Chapter 1. The Beginning of an Ordinary Night. It was around midnight, the hour when the world seems to sink into an eerie stillness, as if even the buildings, streets and sidewalks retreat into their own silent slumber. Louise, a young waitress, worked at a small café on the corner of a rarely frequented street in the city. It wasn't the kind of place where people lingered long after dark, except for a few lost regulars seeking to drown their loneliness in a steaming cup of coffee. That night, everything seemed normal. The last customers had left, and the only audible sound was the ticking of the clock and the gentle creak of the back door that tended to sway with every gust of wind. Louise, her brown hair tied up in a messy ponytail, wiped down the last table, her thoughts drifting to the accumulated fatigue of the week. She was already dreaming of the warmth of her bed and the sweet escape of dreams. But just as she was preparing to close the cafe, the bell hanging from the front door jingled, signaling a new arrival. She looked up, a bit surprised. No one ever came this late. A man entered, dressed in a long black coat that seemed too thick for the mild autumn weather. His face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, an old-fashioned fedora that added a touch of anachronistic elegance to his figure. He walked quietly to the counter, each of his steps emitting a dull, strange sound on the wooden floor. "Good evening," he said in a low, almost monotone voice as he sat at the bar. Louise hesitated for a moment. There was something odd about his appearance, in the way he seemed to glide more than walk. She felt an inexplicable shiver, as if this man had brought with him a cold breath from another time. "Good evening. What can I get you?" she replied politely, though a small inner voice advised her to close up quickly and go home. The man didn't answer right away. He seemed to be contemplating something beyond the cafe's fogged windows before slowly turning his head towards Louise. "A black coffee, please," he finally said in a deep, detached whisper. Louise set to work, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over her. After all, he was just a late-night customer, like dozens she had seen before. But there was something indefinable in the air, as though the atmosphere had grown heavier the moment he stepped inside. Chapter 2. Details that disturb. Louise placed the cup of coffee in front of the man, who nodded his thanks. She returned to her counter, hoping this strange customer would drink quickly and leave. But instead of sipping his coffee, he remained motionless, his fingers lightly tracing the edge of the cup without lifting it. The silence in the cafe became oppressive. Normally she would hear cars passing outside, the murmurs of the night, but this time everything seemed muffled. Louise found herself glancing at the man out of the corner of her eye. He barely moved, except to gently touch the rim of the cup. It was as if he was there, but absent at the same time, like a blurry memory on the edge of her consciousness. She shook her head, scolding herself for letting her imagination run wild. Then she noticed something odd, the man's reflection in the window. Or rather, the lack of it. Her eyes widened slightly and she straightened. She stared at the window. The reflection of the cafe's soft lights was visible, as were the tables, the chairs, and even her own image. But the man, sitting just a few feet away, cast no reflection on the glass. Louise felt a wave of panic rising inside her. She glanced quickly at the man, but he was still there, perfectly still. Her mind desperately searched for a rational explanation. Maybe the light was playing tricks. Maybe she was too tired. Maybe... "Is everything all right?" the man suddenly asked, his deep voice breaking the silence. Louise jumped. She finally met his gaze. His eyes were a deep, bottomless black, unfathomable like two gaping holes. She felt as if she were getting lost in their depth, as though these eyes hid an abyss from which she could never escape. Yes, everything's fine," she answered awkwardly, trying to steady her voice. The man didn't reply. He simply smiled. But it was not a reassuring smile. It was cold, mechanical, as if he had forgotten how a human should actually smile. Louise looked away, searching for a distraction. The phone behind the counter. Maybe she could call her boss, make up an emergency to leave the cafe. But before she could move, the man slowly rose from his seat. Chapter 3. The Strange Offer. He stood before her, imposing yet strangely silent, his face still partially hidden by the shadow of his hat. Louise swallowed hard, feeling increasingly uneasy under his steady gaze. "I'll be leaving now," he announced calmly, as though he had guessed her intention to end the encounter. "But before I go, I would like to make you an offer." She frowned, trying to mask her growing discomfort. "An offer?" she repeated, puzzled. The man nodded. He pulled a small, worn black leather envelope from his coat pocket and placed it delicately on the counter before her. "You're an interesting person, Louise," he said softly, and the mere fact that he knew her name sent a chill down her spine. "Take this envelope and open it at home. Inside, you'll find an opportunity, a chance that few people ever receive. But be careful, because every opportunity comes with a risk." Louise stared at him, her hands trembling. She wanted to refuse, to tell him she wasn't interested, that she wanted nothing to do with this strange offer. But her curiosity rooted her to the spot. "What do you mean?" she finally asked, her voice wavering slightly. "You'll understand when you open it," he replied, smiling again, that cold smile that unsettled her so much. Without another word, he turned and headed for the door. The bell jingled again as he passed through, but this time it sounded oddly hollow, as if it came from far away. Louise stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the black envelope. Silence fell over the café once more, heavier than ever. Chapter 4. Opening the envelope. Louise returned home, her mind racing. She hadn't been able to stop thinking about the man, his cryptic words, and most of all, the black envelope he had left behind. Her fingers had clutched it tightly all the way home, as if it held an answer she was subconsciously seeking. Sitting on her bed in her modest apartment, she examined the envelope under the dim light of her bedside lamp. The air around her felt strangely charged, as if the room itself was holding its breath. She swallowed, hesitated one last time, then carefully opened the envelope. Inside, she found a single sheet of paper folded in two. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded it. The paper seemed old, yellowed with time, but the words written on it were perfectly legible. "Choose a fate," it simply read in elegant black letters. Louise frowned. She turned the paper over, looking for more explanations, but there was nothing else. Just that cryptic sentence. Choose a fate? What was that supposed to mean? She felt a wave of frustration rising inside her. Was this a cruel joke? A twisted game? She stood up abruptly, ready to throw the envelope and letter away, but something stopped her. A faint whisper. She turned her head. The sound seemed to come from nowhere, yet it was there, insistent, almost hypnotic. The more she listened, the more it seemed that this whisper was calling her name. "Louise."